The first time I realized I was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix was a Tuesday. There was nothing special about it, no big blow-up, no dramatic moment. Just a slow, grinding awareness, like water eroding stone. I came home from a 10-hour workday at the firm, grocery bags cutting into my fingers, only to find Ethan stretched out on the couch, still in the same hoodie and joggers he wore when I left that morning. A half-eaten bowl of cereal rested on the coffee table, right beside a stack of unopened envelopes labeled Final Notice. I said nothing at first. I didn't want the fight. I dropped the groceries in the kitchen, opened the fridge, and began unloading, only to realize we were out of space again. Most of the shelves were filled with the ingredients he swore he'd use for his wellness recipes. Vegan miso paste, spirulina powder, jars of fermented God knows what. The app was supposed to be called BreatheSync, a mindfulness tool that helped users track mood and nutrition. He had been building the brand for almost 2 years. All he'd built was a landing page and a backlog of subscription charges on my credit card. "Hey babe," he called out as I moved containers around, trying to fit a carton of eggs. "Did you get the almond butter?" "Of course I did. I always did." "Yeah. It's in the bag with the chia seeds." He didn't offer to help. He never did anymore. I don't know when that stopped. Probably sometime after he quit his job to go all in on the app. Back then, he'd said it with stars in his eyes, like he was Steve Jobs in sweatpants. I'd nodded and smiled because I loved him. Because I believed in his potential. But love gets heavy when it's carrying 2 people alone. By the time dinner was made, and he was complaining the tofu wasn't crispy enough, I was counting backward from 10 to keep myself from screaming. Not because I couldn't handle criticism, God knows my job handed out enough of that, but because there was never any gratitude. No thank you. No, how was your day? Just expectations that kept stacking higher on my back. Camellia Lane looked picturesque from the outside, lined with modest 2-bedroom apartments and little flower beds everyone pretended to maintain. But behind our door, Unit 3B, I was sinking. Every rent check came from my account. Every utility bill, every phone plan, every carton of overpriced oat milk. I even started skipping lunch at work to stretch groceries farther. Meanwhile, Ethan spent his days networking with other dreamers at local coffee shops and reading self-help books he never finished. He always said, "We're investing in something bigger, Jazz. You'll see." But all I saw was my savings draining, my energy fraying, and a man who used to want something for himself, now content to ride my effort like a wave. Sometimes, I'd pass his childhood home on the way to work, a charming house with blue shutters, just 10 minutes from our place. His mom still lived there with his sister Talia. He never wanted to move far from it. Said it was comforting. Maybe that should have told me something. That he needed to feel cradled by familiarity while I was always stretching, striving, reaching. We were orbiting different things. He, nostalgia. Me, a future. I tried talking to him once. Just once. Told him I felt like everything was on me. That maybe he could contribute more, even part-time. He smiled, kissed my forehead, and said, "I know it's tough right now, babe, but when this takes off, you won't have to work another day in your life." Then he went right back to typing on his laptop, probably posting another motivational quote to the app's Instagram page, an account that had more hashtags than followers. That night, I sat alone on the balcony while he snored inside. The streetlight flickered in that same annoying rhythm it always did, casting shadows across the railing. I used to imagine us moving somewhere bigger, somewhere quieter. A little yard. A reading nook. Maybe a porch swing. But dreams like that need 2 people paddling in the same direction. And all I could feel now was the imbalance in the boat. It wasn't just the bills or the food or the chores. It was the way he stopped looking at me like a person. I had become infrastructure. Background noise. The engine that kept running so he could keep dreaming. And the saddest part? I missed myself. I missed laughing without effort. I missed walking into my own home and feeling peace instead of pressure. I missed believing that love was enough. That Tuesday, as I scrubbed dishes that weren't mine and paid bills I didn't make, something cracked inside me, not like a plate shattering, more like the first fracture in a sidewalk before weeds break through. I didn't know it yet, but something had shifted. Quietly. Irrevocably. And Camellia Lane would never feel the same again. The thing about Ethan's mother, Lorraine Graves, is that she doesn't ask for respect. She demands it with the self-righteousness of someone who believes she invented the concept. From the moment I first stepped into that polished house on Thornhill Avenue, I knew where I stood. Beneath her, beside the entryway rug, preferably with my shoes off and my mouth shut. Lorraine had a way of greeting me that made my skin crawl. Not outright cruel, no, she was far too practiced for that. Instead, it was the tight smile, the lingering pause before saying my name like she had to summon the effort. "Jasmine," she'd say, as if tasting something unpleasant. "You look functional." I don't think she meant it as an insult, but it landed like one every time. Then she'd turn to Ethan, her face softening like warm butter. "You're too thin, sweetheart. Is she feeding you?" It was always like that. The underhanded remarks. The performative concern. And Ethan? He just chuckled like we were all playing some lighthearted game. He never said, "That's not okay," or even, "Don't talk to her like that." He just let it happen. Worse was Talia, Ethan's older sister. She and Lorraine were two halves of the same coin, judgmental, overbearing, and completely convinced the world owed them something. Talia called me cheap once because I showed up to a birthday dinner in a blouse from a discount rack. She said it with a grin and a glass of wine in hand, like cruelty was an inside joke only she understood. "You really know how to stretch a dollar, huh, Jazz?" she'd said, laughing. "No shame in being frugal. Especially when you've got a husband, in transition." And Ethan? He actually laughed. It was during one of these insufferable visits, Sunday lunch, I think, though the food was always cold by the time Lorraine finished listing everything wrong with modern society, that the final straw was handed to me, gift-wrapped in entitlement. We were all seated in the dining room, the chandelier above flickering slightly, and Lorraine fussing over which linens she used. Talia was scrolling on her phone, not even pretending to engage, when she suddenly looked up and said, "Oh, Jasmine, we're doing a group gift for Cousin Marnie's baby shower." I blinked. Okay, it's a curated hamper. Organic, gender-neutral, all that stuff. Comes to $600. You'll chip in, obviously. I nearly choked on my water. $600? For a hamper. She rolled her eyes. It's a group gift. We're splitting it between 4 people, but Mom and I have already ordered it, so if you could just Venmo me, that'd be great. I turned to Ethan, waiting for him to say something, anything. That we hadn't agreed to that. That it was unreasonable. That maybe someone should have asked before spending hundreds on our behalf. But he didn't. He just looked at me and said, "Babe, just send it. It's for family." It was the calm way he said it that made my blood boil. Like it wasn't a discussion. Like I was the one being unreasonable. Never mind that our rent was late or that he hadn't contributed a cent to groceries in weeks. Never mind that I was juggling work stress and budgeting apps while they breezed through life in a house paid off decades ago. I clenched my hands in my lap and forced a tight smile. "You're telling me I owe $600 for something I didn't agree to?" Lorraine chimed in then, all sweetness laced with venom. "Jasmine, dear, no one's trying to make this difficult. We just assumed you'd want to contribute. After all, Marnie's practically your family now." I wanted to laugh. Or scream. But mostly, I just felt hollow. Like the air had been sucked from the room and I was the only one gasping. I looked around at the Thornhill house, the gleaming tile floors, the floral wallpaper, the smug sense of comfort, and realized I didn't belong here. Not just in the room, but in their world. A world where appearances mattered more than effort, and my worth was measured by how useful I was to them. I handed over the money that night. Not because I wanted to, but because I knew if I didn't, they'd talk about me. Whisper about how I was ungrateful or tight-fisted. And Ethan wouldn't defend me. He never did. On the way home, he was oddly quiet, like he knew I was boiling but didn't want to stir the pot. I stared out the window, watching streetlights blur past Camellia Lane. I thought about how often I'd swallowed things. Let them slide. Bit my tongue so hard I'd started to taste blood. I realized something that night. I wasn't just tired from work or tired of paying for everything, I was tired of being alone while standing beside someone. Ethan hadn't just failed to support me, he had handed me over to the wolves and asked me to smile about it. And in that silence, as our car pulled into the driveway and he casually asked what was for dinner, I knew it. I wasn't just unsupported, I was being used. I hadn't even raised my voice. That was the part that stuck with me the most. I wasn't angry, not outwardly. I didn't slam any doors, didn't throw anything, didn't even cry. I just asked him plainly, calmly, why he let his sister humiliate me, why he expected me to finance gifts and groceries and his lifestyle, and why, after everything, I still felt like the outsider in my own marriage. Ethan leaned against the kitchen counter, arms folded across his chest, wearing that smug little half-smile he always wore when he thought he had the upper hand. "You're making a big deal out of nothing." "Nothing," I repeated, my voice still steady, though I could feel heat crawling up my neck. "It's not about the money, Jasmine. It's about respect." "And frankly," he said, tilting his head like a father correcting a child, "you've been real disrespectful lately. You push back too much. A wife is supposed to support her husband. Obey him." That word, obey, hit me like a slap. I blinked, thinking I must have misheard him. "Obey?" I said. "Is that really what you think marriage is?" He didn't flinch. "A man leads. A wife follows. That's how it's supposed to be. I shouldn't have to justify myself to you. You're either with me or you're against me." It was like a switch flipped inside me. All those months, no, years of swallowing discomfort, explaining away his laziness, covering for him, defending him when my friends asked how I was holding up. I'd spent so long pretending things were fine that I forgot what my voice sounded like when I used it for myself. "You don't lead," I said quietly. "You coast." He didn't like that. His jaw tightened, and his nostrils flared. "Watch it, Jasmine. I'm being serious. If this is how it's going to be, if you're going to keep questioning me, challenging me, then maybe we shouldn't be married." It hung in the air between us, bold and bitter. "I'm not scared of divorce," I said after a long moment. And I meant it. He scoffed. "Yeah, okay. Like you'd really walk away. You'd fall apart without me." He actually believed that. That I'd grovel, beg him to stay. That I needed him more than he needed me. That the weight I carried every day was something he gave me the privilege of holding. "I'm not the one who quit my job and started freeloading," I said calmly. "I'm not the one who needs someone else to survive." He didn't speak after that. Just stormed out of the room, muttering something under his breath about me, needing to think real hard about what kind of wife I wanted to be. But I did think. All weekend, in fact. I stayed home while he went to visit Lorraine and Talia, probably expecting me to stew in guilt and come crawling back with an apology. But instead, I made tea. I cleaned the apartment, not for him, but for me. I lit a candle, opened the windows, and let the breeze wash over me like a baptism. And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt free. I started imagining a different life. One without constant tension, without that low-grade anxiety humming beneath every interaction. I pictured a space that belonged to me alone, a place where I could breathe, think, exist without needing to justify every decision, every dollar. That night, I opened my laptop and started making a list. What I earned, what I spent, what I could save. I browsed real estate listings in neighborhoods I used to drive through just to feel hopeful. Mulberry Rise popped up, soft pastel homes with front porches and trees that arched across narrow streets. I could almost hear the quiet there, almost feel it in my bones. I didn't cry once that weekend. I thought I might, but I didn't. I felt something stronger instead. Something steadier. Like the ground beneath me wasn't crumbling, I was finally stepping off the crumbling ledge. By the time Ethan returned Sunday night, all puffed up from his little ego trip at Thornhill, I was already changed. He kissed my cheek absently and asked if there was anything to eat. I handed him leftovers without saying much, and he didn't notice the difference in my eyes, in my spine, in the silence I no longer feared. I'd let him think he was in control one last time. That was fine. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. Not even my best friend, not my parents'. It had to be just mine at first. Quiet, secret, sacred. Like a candle lit in a dark room, flickering with possibility. The morning after Ethan's threat, I got up before him, slipped into the living room, and sat on the couch with my laptop in my lap and my coffee warm between my palms. It was still barely light out, the sky soft and gray. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the fridge and the occasional shuffle from the bedroom. I typed "homes for sale Mulberry Rise" into the search bar, and there it was, the first spark. Rows of tidy listings, each one promising something more than square footage or mortgage estimates. They promise space, peace, autonomy. Every image I clicked opened like a window into another life. Pale blue shutters, front porches lined with flower pots, kitchens where I could breathe, think, be. Mulberry Rise had always lingered in the back of my mind like a place you dream about but never touch. I used to pass it on the way to meetings across town, small homes with blooming trees and neighbors who waved. It looked like something out of a movie or the pages of a life I thought belonged to someone else. Someone freer. But suddenly it didn't feel so distant. Not impossible. Not with a plan. I opened a blank spreadsheet and began. My salary. The bills. What I'd been spending on groceries, rent, phone plans, subscriptions, most of which Ethan used more than I did. Then I started cutting. First the obvious things, his luxury vitamin subscription, the third-tier streaming platform, the food delivery service he ordered from twice a week for research. Then it became more subtle. I stopped buying coffee at work. I packed lunch every day. I even canceled my rarely used yoga membership and started stretching at home with a YouTube playlist. Each adjustment was a small rebellion. Every dollar I saved was a crack in the walls Ethan had built around my independence. I opened a new bank account in my name alone and routed part of my paycheck into it, just enough to avoid suspicion, just enough to grow a little escape fund, week by week. I walked around the apartment in a new way after that. Not as a tenant in my own life, but as a woman counting the days. I started to sort my belongings when he wasn't home. Not packing yet, just mentally organizing. What was mine? What I'd take? What I'd leave behind without regret? Every time he passed me by with a request or a complaint, "We're out of oat milk again," or "You forgot to pay the internet bill," I'd nod, smile faintly, and think, not much longer. The dream sharpened quickly. There was one house in particular, a small white cottage with navy blue shutters and a bright red door on Lavender Street in the heart of Mulberry Rise. It wasn't flashy, but it had character. It had a wraparound porch with room for 2 rocking chairs, a kitchen with a window above the sink, a fireplace, not that I needed one, but it felt cozy. Like home. My home. I saved the listing and returned to it every night before bed, watching the pictures the way some people watch romance movies or read love stories. That little house was becoming mine long before I ever made the call. I could see myself there, padding across the wooden floors in socks, pouring tea in the kitchen while soft music played, sleeping through the night without the weight of resentment pressed into the mattress beside me. I started taking different routes after work, ones that detoured through Mulberry Rise. I'd drive slowly, windows down, pretending I already belonged there. I memorized the streets, the curves, the corners where kids rode bikes and neighbors waved from porches. No one knew me there, and yet I felt seen. Sometimes, Ethan would ask why I was getting home later than usual. I'd lie without blinking. Traffic, extra tasks at work, a stop at the grocery store. He never questioned it much. He was usually too absorbed in trying to refine his brand voice or watching YouTube videos on how to grow a social media audience. I smiled through it all, quietly collecting bricks for the road out. The red-doored cottage stayed on the market longer than I expected. I took it as a sign. I started moving faster, cutting more, saving harder. When my account reached a certain number, enough for the down payment, the closing costs, the first few months of expenses, I called the agent. Her name was Alicia. She had a warm voice, the kind that made me feel like this wasn't crazy. Like women did this all the time. Like escape was just another kind of homecoming. By the end of that call, I was booked for a private tour the following Saturday. Ethan would be gone again, another weekend at Thornhill, getting his ego stroked by Lorraine and Talia. I'd told him I had a work deadline. He didn't ask twice. The house was even better in person. Sunlight spilled across the floors in warm, perfect lines. It smelled faintly of lemon and old wood. I stood in the living room, hand resting lightly on the fireplace mantel, and felt something shift deep inside me. This was it. This was mine. And for the first time in a long, long time. I felt like I was too. I started with a small box, just one. It was barely big enough to fit the framed photo of my college graduation, the locket my mother gave me when I got my first promotion, and a few old journals I hadn't dared open in years. I packed it on a Tuesday morning while Ethan was still asleep, snoring softly on the couch, mouth open, arms splayed like he'd fought off the weight of the world and lost. I closed the box slowly, taped it carefully, and labeled the bottom in tiny letters, "Personal, Willow Heights." My parents didn't ask many questions when I called. Just said, "Of course, sweetheart," when I asked if I could send a few boxes over for storage. My mother's voice was gentle, but I could tell she sensed something was shifting. She didn't pry. That was one of the things I loved most about her. She always waited for me to come to her in my own time. Ethan never noticed the missing books from the shelf or the gradually disappearing stack of photo albums. He didn't ask where the blue throw blanket went or why I suddenly seemed so obsessed with spring cleaning. If anything, he seemed grateful I was finally getting the place in order. He said it like he was encouraging me to continue tidying his mess. The cottage on Mulberry Rise had passed inspection. Alicia called me with a smile in her voice, saying the seller was eager to close. I made the offer, wired the down payment, and signed the documents one trembling signature at a time. When the confirmation email arrived, "Welcome home, Jasmine Porter," I just stared at it. My name, no hyphen, no graves. Just me. I printed it, folded it, slipped it between the pages of a book Ethan would never open. The days blurred after that. At work, I kept my head down, met my deadlines, smiled when expected. At home, I became a shadow, present, polite, distant. Ethan didn't ask why I wasn't initiating conversations anymore, or why I no longer reminded him to pay bills that sat unopened on the counter. He'd talk about new branding ideas for BreatheSync, some beta test he wanted to launch, once we had a little more capital, and I'd nod vaguely while mentally calculating what still needed to be boxed and sent. Clothes went next. The ones I loved, the ones that made me feel alive, like me, were folded into neat bundles and shipped to Willow Heights in 3-day intervals. The ones I didn't care about, the ones I wore when I needed to shrink and disappear, I left in the closet like a costume. I kept a checklist tucked in my wallet, laminated with resolve. One column for items already sent. One for things I'd take last minute. One for tasks Ethan would never see coming. Each ticked box was a breath of oxygen, a reminder that freedom wasn't far. One evening, while he was FaceTiming Talia in the bedroom, I wandered into the bathroom and caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired, yes, but something in my eyes had shifted. Not just weariness. Focus. Clarity. I touched my cheek, leaned closer. I could see her again, the version of me that used to laugh from her stomach, that used to dance barefoot in the kitchen just because the right song came on. The next morning, I stood on the porch of the cottage for the first time as its owner. I had come alone, taking a half day off work without telling Ethan. The sky was pale blue, and the wind rustled the trees like a whisper saying, "You made it." I walked through each room slowly. My footsteps echoed softly on the hardwood. Sunlight spilled across the floor like honey. I stood in the kitchen and pictured Sunday breakfasts with cinnamon rolls. I stood in the bedroom and imagined peace, real, uninterrupted sleep. I didn't cry. I thought I would, but I didn't. The moment was too quiet, too sacred for tears. I ran my fingers along the fireplace mantel and whispered, "I'm coming." By the time I returned to Camellia Lane that night, Ethan was ranting about an influencer who'd ignored his pitch email. I listened half-heartedly, setting my purse down gently, careful not to break the illusion. He didn't notice the difference in me. That the clock was ticking, that every smile I gave him now was a countdown disguised as kindness. "I'm thinking of rebranding," he said. "Something like Inner Glow or Vital Sync. Thoughts?" I paused just long enough to let him think I was considering. "Vital Sync sounds good." He grinned, pleased. "Knew you'd like it." I smiled back and walked to the kitchen. My keys, my real keys, sat buried in my purse. The ones for the red door on Mulberry Rise. The ones that unlocked a life I was already claiming. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was counting down. And I was almost at 0. The quiet was different that day. Not the suffocating kind that usually wrapped itself around me in the apartment, thick with the heaviness of unspoken resentment. This quiet was clean. Sharp. Final. It was the kind that came right before a first breath, not a last one. I woke up before the sun rose, the apartment still wrapped in shadow, and sat for a moment at the edge of the bed Ethan hadn't slept in for 2 nights. He was at Thornhill again. Something about his mother needing help organizing boxes in the attic and Talia not being great with ladders. I didn't question it. I didn't need to. His absence was a gift. I got up, made myself tea, and walked room to room like I was saying goodbye, not to the space, but to the version of me who had tolerated so much within its walls. I didn't pack in a frenzy. I didn't need to. Everything was already gone, shipped, hidden, or mentally marked as disposable. All that remained were essentials, the few things I hadn't sent ahead, a suitcase with clothes for the next few weeks, my documents, my laptop, a few framed photos I had always kept on my nightstand. I placed each one gently into a small tote bag, then zipped the suitcase closed and left it by the door. The apartment looked almost sterile now, devoid of any warmth. It was never mine, really, not in the way the Mulberry Rise cottage was. Camellia Lane had always belonged to compromise, to half gestures and low expectations. I had walked on eggshells for so long I forgot what steady ground felt like. But not anymore. Not today. My phone buzzed once, my mom, checking in. I sent her a quick thumbs up and promised to call later. They were expecting me at the cottage by mid-afternoon. I would meet them there after one final sweep, after locking the door on this life for good. By 10 o'clock, I was out. The keys jingled in my hand as I stepped onto the landing. I stood there for a second, just breathing. The hallway smelled like the same stale detergent and forgotten pizza boxes, but even that felt lighter now. I looked back once, at the chipped paint on the door, the apartment number I used to think meant something. Then I locked the door, slid the keys through the mail slot, and turned away. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel panic. I felt clarity. The drive to Mulberry Rise was quiet, music low, windows down. The air was crisp, spring trying to edge its way in, the trees outside budding with shy green leaves. As I pulled into the driveway, sunlight spilled through the windshield and danced across the porch. My porch. My red door. My parents' car was already there, parked neatly along the curb. When I stepped out, my mom was waiting with a smile that reached her eyes. My dad followed behind her, carrying a bag of groceries like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Welcome home," my mom said as she pulled me into a hug. I didn't speak for a moment. I just pressed my face into her shoulder and let the steadiness of her presence anchor me. Then I laughed, soft and stunned, because it was real. I was here. I had done it. We spent the afternoon unpacking the essentials. My mom fluttered through the kitchen like she was blessing it with every movement. Stocking the fridge, lining the cabinets, folding towels into perfect thirds. My dad set up my router, hung my coat hooks, and double-checked the locks with a precision only he had. It was simple, but it was sacred. There was no tension, no obligation, no undercurrent of resentment. Just love, filling up the empty spaces. By evening, the cottage smelled like garlic and rosemary, my mom's roasted chicken in the oven, our voices echoing off freshly painted walls. I lit a few candles, placed flowers in a jar on the table, and stepped outside for a moment of stillness. The porch felt like a promise. I leaned on the railing and looked out over the small lawn, the sidewalk curving gently through the neighborhood. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime rang. I closed my eyes and let the sound settle into my chest. When I opened them again, I felt different. Not just relieved. Not just free. Whole. This was what I had been building toward. Not just an escape, but a beginning. A space to grow, to remember who I was before I got buried beneath someone else's needs. Before I confused being needed with being loved. I slept deeply that night for the first time in what felt like years. No tension in my shoulders. No phantom dread creeping in. Just clean sheets, quiet air, and the comforting creak of my new home settling around me. In the morning, I woke to birdsong instead of Ethan's snoring. I brewed coffee in my own kitchen, barefoot and smiling. And as the first golden light spilled across the hardwood floor, I said the words I hadn't dared say out loud until then. I'm free. And I meant it. Every syllable. I didn't expect the call to come so quickly. I figured he'd text first, or maybe send one of those self-pitying emails full of half apologies and confusion. But no, Ethan called me just after noon the day he returned to Camellia Lane. I saw the name flash across the screen while I sat in the sunlit kitchen of my new home, eating leftover chicken salad from the night before, the one my mother had made with just the right touch of dill. The phone vibrated once, then again. I didn't pick up right away. I let it ring while I leaned back in my chair, stared out the window, and let the calm settle around me like a second skin. I thought about all the times I'd scrambled to answer his calls, during meetings, while cooking, even during my rare quiet moments, always afraid something would be wrong or that he'd get angry if I didn't respond quickly enough. But now? I wasn't afraid. Not of his voice, not of his disappointment, not of his absence. I was beyond it. The third time he called, I answered. Jasmine? His voice was sharp, frantic. I could hear movement in the background, drawers opening, footsteps pacing. Where are you? What the hell is going on? I didn't reply right away. I let the silence hang, let him stew in it. I came home, he continued, breathing hard. Everything's gone. The apartment is empty. Your clothes, your computer. Jasmine, even the damn shower curtain is missing. I let out a soft breath. I thought you liked minimalist design. You think this is funny? He snapped. What the hell is this? It's what you asked for, I said, voice calm, steady. You told me a wife should obey or risk losing her husband. So I took the risk. And I lost you. Or maybe I freed myself. Either way, it's done. He went quiet for a beat. I could hear the sound of a drawer slamming shut, a frustrated exhale. You walked out? Just like that? Yes, I said. Just like that. He laughed bitterly. You really think you can survive without me? I looked around the kitchen, my kitchen. The lightwood counters, the little herb garden on the sill, the calendar on the fridge already marked with dinner plans and reminders I had made for myself. I was surviving just fine. I already am, I said simply. You didn't even give me a chance to fix things. You gave me an ultimatum, Ethan, I said. You thought I'd beg. You thought threatening divorce would scare me into submission. But it didn't. It gave me clarity. His breathing grew uneven. You don't just walk out of a marriage without talking about it. We stopped talking about everything a long time ago, I replied. You just didn't notice. There was a long pause then. I imagined him standing in the middle of the hollow apartment, the weight of my absence finally sinking in. No stocked fridge. No clean laundry. No Jasmine to carry the weight of 2 lives. I gave everything to you, he said quietly. No, I replied, and this time my voice didn't waver. I gave everything to you. I paid the bills. I fed us. I worked 10-hour days while you dreamed. I stayed silent while your family insulted me, and you said nothing. And when I asked for respect, you gave me threats. You blindsided me, he muttered. No, I said again, firmer now. You blinded yourself. I heard something crash on his end, maybe the phone being dropped or something shoved off the table. I didn't flinch. I didn't care. You don't get to rewrite the ending now just because it doesn't serve you, I continued. This isn't a movie where the husband has an epiphany and the wife forgets all the years she's spent invisible. This is real. This is over. So you're just done? He said bitterly. That's it. I filed this morning, I told him, voice smooth as glass. The papers should be in your inbox. I signed them already. All you have to do is respond. You won't even talk to me in person? I have nothing left to say that hasn't already been ignored, I replied. I tried. For years, I tried. You just never noticed until it cost you something. Silence stretched again, but this time I didn't fill it. I let it hang. Let him sit with the echo of the power he used to think he had. Goodbye, Ethan, I said at last. You're making a mistake, he muttered, voice small now. I smiled. No, for the first time, I'm not. And then I ended the call. Just like that. No tears. No anger. Just peace. I set the phone down, leaned back in my chair, and took another bite of chicken salad. Outside the window, a bird landed on the fence, feathers ruffling in the breeze. The sun warmed the back of my neck as if the universe itself was nodding in agreement. He had always believed I wouldn't leave. He had no idea I'd already left long before I walked out the door. It was supposed to be a celebration. My first dinner in my new home, the table glowing under soft light, filled with laughter, the comforting smells of roasted garlic and buttery rolls floating through the cottage. My parents were both seated, my mom talking about how she might grow herbs in the backyard come summer, my dad teasing her about her last attempt with rosemary that had somehow ended in a spider infestation. I was pouring tea, my cheeks warm from the wine and the comfort of knowing I had finally made it, free, safe, no longer tiptoeing around someone else's moods. I was home. Not a shared space I had to shrink in, not a place I paid for while feeling like a guest. This was mine, and this dinner, this joy, this sense of lightness, it was mine too. Then the doorbell rang. At first, I thought it was a neighbor, maybe someone stopping by to say hello, bring cookies, welcome me to Mulberry Rise like in the movies. I even smiled as I walked toward the front door, napkin still in hand. But the moment I opened it, the warmth drained from my body like someone had cut the power. Ethan. Behind him stood Lorraine, stiff as ever in her powder blue trench coat, and Talia, arms crossed, eyes already rolling. All three of them, crammed onto my porch like they owned it, like they belonged there. I blinked, stunned, thinking for one ridiculous second that maybe they had the wrong address. We need to come in, Ethan said, his tone clipped, jaw tight. I stared at him, then at the two women flanking him like some kind of twisted welcome committee. No, I said, the word clear and firm. You don't. Lorraine didn't even wait for me to invite her. She stepped forward, peering past my shoulder. Well, this is quaint. I suppose it'll do for now. For what? I asked, though I already hated the question forming on my tongue. For us, Ethan said. Until we figure things out. My laugh came out sharper than I intended. You think you're moving in with me? You can't just walk out on your husband and act like everything's fine, Lorraine snapped. You owe Ethan support. Marriage isn't something you just toss away when you're bored. You're not welcome here, I said, stepping firmly in front of the door. None of you are. Talia rolled her eyes. Wow, she really thinks she's better than us now. A little mortgage and suddenly she's a queen. No, I said, calm even though my heart was thudding. I don't think I'm better. I just think I'm finally done being used. Ethan took a step forward. You're overreacting. You left because of a fight. We'll get through this. Mom and Talia are just here to help us talk. This isn't a discussion, I said. And this isn't your house. You can't be serious, Lorraine barked. Ethan has nowhere to stay. He's still your husband. Not for long, I replied. And that's not my problem anymore. You really called the police? Talia sneered, as if daring me. I hadn't. Not yet. But that was changing. I turned and calmly picked up my phone from the console near the door. You have 30 seconds to get off my property before I make this official. Ethan looked wounded. You're really doing this? After everything? Yes. After everything, I said, staring him down. After the lies. After the laziness. After the threats. After your mother and sister treated me like a servant and you stood there silent. Lorraine stepped forward again. You ungrateful little girl. I held up a hand. Try me, Lorraine. Say one more word like that on my property. My father appeared behind me then. Quiet, composed, but unmistakably protective. Is there a problem here? Lorraine's mouth snapped shut. Ethan looked at him, then back at me. You don't have to do this. But I already had. I pressed the call button and spoke clearly to the dispatcher. Yes, I have trespassers at my residence. They were asked to leave and are refusing. I feel unsafe. Ethan's eyes widened. You're calling the cops on your own husband? You're not my husband anymore, I said, voice cold. You're a man standing on my porch, uninvited. That's all. The dispatcher asked a few more questions. I gave my address, confirmed no weapons were involved, said I'd wait inside. I hung up and stepped back. You need to leave, I said again. Now. Lorraine gave Ethan a look that said do something, but he was frozen, caught between his own entitlement and the realization that it no longer held any weight here. You'll regret this, Talia spat as she turned to go. No, I whispered after I shut the door, locking it behind them. I won't. Inside, my mother wrapped her arm around my shoulder and guided me back to the table. My dad poured more tea. The room still smelled like dinner, still held laughter waiting to be resumed. They had come to crash through my peace like a wrecking ball. But they forgot one thing: this was my home. And I wasn't theirs to push around anymore. The flashing blue lights bathed the front of my cottage in eerie rhythm, reflecting off the window panes like sirens in a dream. I stood just inside the door, arms folded tight across my chest, while two officers stepped calmly onto the porch and approached the still bickering trio, Ethan, Lorraine, and Talia. My heartbeat, once jackhammering, began to slow with each confident step the officers took toward them. My mother stood beside me, one hand resting lightly on my back, a quiet, grounding presence. My father stood just behind her, silent and firm, eyes narrowed as he watched the drama unfold with a mixture of fury and restraint. This is a mistake, Ethan said to the officer, arms raised in exasperation. My wife's just upset. She's being emotional. This isn't necessary. The officer glanced back at me through the open doorway. You're Jasmine Porter? Yes, I said, stepping forward without hesitation. They were asked to leave. Multiple times. They refused. They showed up uninvited, threatened to stay, and made it clear they weren't leaving peacefully. Lorraine stepped in with that familiar, grating voice of hers. We're family. This is a domestic misunderstanding, officer. She's having a moment. You know how women get. My jaw clenched. The casual dismissal, the assumption that I could be waved off like a child having a tantrum, made me want to scream. But I didn't. I stood taller. I let the facts speak for themselves. I'm filing a formal report, I told the officer. And I want a restraining order. On all three. Ethan's face drained of color. What? Jasmine, come on. She's being ridiculous, Talia interjected. This is harassment? You're serious? The officer raised a hand, voice level. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step off the property. Now. I told you, I said, my voice cool. This isn't your house. This isn't your life. You don't get to show up and act like it is. I'm your husband. Ethan snapped. Not anymore, I replied. You lost that role the moment you decided I was just a wallet and a servant wrapped into one. Ethan's posture shifted then. The bravado started to crumble, bit by bit, as the reality of the situation set in. The lights. The neighbors stepping outside to peek. The police standing between him and what he used to control. Sir, one of the officers said, stepping closer, you've been formally asked to leave this property. If you continue to resist, we'll be forced to charge you with trespassing and harassment. Ethan's eyes darted around. To his mother. To his sister. Neither of them could help him now. Lorraine's arms were crossed, face sour with disbelief. Talia looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. Fine, Ethan muttered. We're going. I didn't move. I didn't breathe until they were gone, until the officers escorted them off the property and down the driveway, until their angry muttering disappeared into the distance. Only when the patrol car finally pulled away did I feel the tension release from my shoulders. My dad closed the door gently. It's over, he said. Not yet, I whispered. But it will be. The next morning, I stood in the clerk's office with my paperwork in hand. The restraining orders were filed and signed by the afternoon. No contact. No visitation. No loopholes. I made sure of it. It wasn't just about boundaries anymore, it was about safety. It was about finally shutting the door on people who never thought I'd dare lock it. Word traveled fast. Ethan didn't try to call again. Not after the restraining order. Not after the public embarrassment of being removed by police. I heard through a mutual acquaintance, someone from his old job he still kept in touch with, that things were unraveling quickly. His app, which had been hanging by a thread for months, lost its final backer. The one guy willing to float him while he worked on scaling had pulled out. Apparently, Ethan's explanation about being sabotaged by a bitter spouse didn't fly when they saw the formal report. Without my income, without my structure, his fantasy business collapsed like a house of cards. Soon after, the Thornhill house went up for sale. Lorraine had apparently taken out a second mortgage years ago to cover her daughter's credit card debts and some of Ethan's business expenses. I was surprised, and then I wasn't. Entitlement isn't sustainable forever, not without someone like me footing the bill. I watched the listing go live with a quiet satisfaction I didn't expect to feel. Not spite. Not glee. Just peace. The kind that settles deep in your bones when you finally realize the storm behind you can't follow where you're going. That night, I sat on my porch with a glass of wine, the street still and peaceful. Wind rustled through the trees above, and a pair of cardinals hopped across the front lawn like they'd claimed it for themselves. My parents were inside, laughing over a game show, the smell of my mom's cornbread still lingering in the air. I didn't need to speak it aloud, but I did anyway, just to whisper into the wind, "I'm safe now." And for the first time in years, I believed it completely. The walls of the cottage no longer echoed. That was the first sign. In those early days after I moved in, every step I took bounced back at me, empty spaces, unfamiliar silence, the sound of a life being rebuilt from scratch. But now, the echoes had softened, replaced by laughter, music, the clink of dishes, and the hum of conversation that spilled from room to room like sunlight on wood floors. My parents moved in on a rainy Sunday. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. We made the decision together, sitting around my kitchen table with mugs of coffee and cinnamon scones between us. My mother's eyes lit up when I asked them. My father gave a small, quiet smile, the kind that said more than words ever could. They didn't hesitate. There was no guilt, no awkward pause, just love passed between us like a shared secret. Now, they lived here too. My mother had claimed the small spare bedroom facing the garden and turned it into her sanctuary. She hung gauzy curtains, filled the windowsill with potted herbs, and set a book by the bed every night like a ritual. My father took the room next to mine and spent his days tinkering in the garage, fixing things I didn't even realize were broken. And me? I had never felt more whole. Every morning began with sounds I hadn't heard since childhood, the low creak of the floorboards under my father's slippers, the gentle clatter of my mother setting the kettle to boil, their soft voices murmuring about the day ahead. The scent of breakfast always reached me before I stepped into the kitchen. My mother didn't ask if I wanted eggs. She just made them the way I liked, scrambled with chives, toast just a little overdone because that's how I've always eaten it. We didn't speak much about the past. Not out of avoidance, but because we didn't need to. They'd watched me for years, watched me lose pieces of myself, and smiled softly when I insisted I was just tired or just busy. They knew. And now that I was here, they didn't demand explanations. They simply filled the spaces Ethan had hollowed out with unconditional presence. There was something healing in the mundane, something sacred about coming home to people who noticed you without being asked to. My father always made sure the porch light was on before I returned from work. My mother left little notes in the kitchen, reminders to drink more water, to try the new tea she bought, to rest. They never tried to manage me, only to support me. It was what I had given to others for so long, never expecting it in return. Now I received it in abundance. One evening, I came home late after a project deadline kept me at the office. The air outside was cool and thick with the scent of blooming jasmine. Fitting. I parked in the driveway and just sat for a moment, staring at the red door that now felt like a friend. Inside, The lights were warm, golden. I could see my father's silhouette through the living room curtain, hear the soft laughter of my mother in the background. For a moment, I just breathed. Then I went inside. They were in the kitchen, laughing about something on TV, sharing a slice of pie from a plate between them. My mom looked up and smiled. "You're home, sweetheart. Want some?" It wasn't pie that made my throat tighten. It was those words, "You're home." I slipped off my coat, nodded, and joined them at the table. We sat there for an hour, passing forks, talking about nothing and everything. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt no weight on my chest. No tension in my shoulders. No dread about tomorrow. Just warmth. Later that week, we planted flowers in the backyard. My mother chose roses, my father marigolds. I added lavender, needing something soft and fragrant to remind me to breathe. We knelt side by side in the soil, dirt under our nails, knees aching, but it was the kind of ache that felt earned. The kind that said, "You're building something real." We finished just as the sun began to set, its light turning the whole garden golden. My mother leaned into me, her shoulder resting against mine, and whispered, "This place suits you." I smiled, wiping my hands on a towel. "It's because it's mine." She looked at me then, really looked. "It always was. You just had to find your way back." That night, after they went to bed and the house had gone still, I sat alone in the living room. The fire crackled softly. I pulled a blanket around me and let my eyes roam the space. Not one thing remained from my life with Ethan. No hand-me-downs, no remnants of a life where I was invisible. Everything here was chosen with intention, with care. With me in mind. This house didn't just hold me. It reflected me. I thought about the years I spent giving until I was empty, believing love was sacrifice without limit. I thought about the day I finally stopped asking for permission to live freely. And I thought about how it all led to this exact moment. Feet curled beneath me, tea cooling beside me, laughter still echoing faintly from down the hall. This wasn't just a new house. It was a new kind of home, one built on mutual love, on healing, on hope. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't surviving. I was living. Fully, finally, and without apology.